What if the real royal crisis didn't begin with an abdication, a scandal, or even a political revolt, but with a whisper inside the dimly lit halls of Balmoral Castle? What if the future of the British monarchy shifted not because of tradition, lineage, or centuries-old protocol, but because a gravely ill king uttered 6 words that no one expected to hear? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. I want and to be my successor. Let that sink in for a moment. Because if that sentence shocks you, imagine how it felt to the people inside that room. Imagine how it hit the advisors. Imagine how it hit William. Imagine how it hit Camilla, the woman who had fought for decades to be accepted, acknowledged, respected, only to discover that the man she built her life around suddenly no longer trusted her with the crown. So the question is simple: how did we get here? How did the United Kingdom reach a point where the reigning monarch, dangerously ill, facing the most uncertain period of his life, made a decision that goes against what the public expected, what the palace projected, and what the royal family desperately wanted to keep quiet? And why Princess Anne? Why now? Why her? See, this isn't just a story about a king getting sick. It isn't just a story about a royal succession crisis. And it definitely isn't just a story about family tension. Though there's plenty of that. This is the story of a monarchy on the brink. A monarchy forced into a corner. A monarchy whose future suddenly depends not on lineage, but on loyalty. And if you think you've heard everything about the royal family, trust me, you haven't heard this. Let's start at the moment everything changed. The precise moment King Charles realized his health wasn't just declining, it was spiraling. It began quietly. A delayed meeting here. A canceled engagement there. A moment caught on camera where Charles looked unusually pale, unusually tired, unusually diminished. The kind of moment that makes you tilt your head and think, something isn't right. Doctors confirmed it behind closed doors. The cancer he had been privately battling was not responding to treatment the way they hoped. There was concern, then worry, then alarm. But something else happened around this time, something the public couldn't see. Charles began withdrawing emotionally from Camilla. That's where the contradictions started. Because publicly, they seemed united, hand in hand, smiling, presenting a stable front. But inside the palace, sources told of tension, frustration, occasional outbursts, long silences. Why? That is one of the questions we're going to explore in this story. And trust me, the answer is far more complicated than a fight or a disagreement. It reaches deep into the emotional landscape of a man facing his mortality and asking himself who he truly trusts. And trust, that's the word everything hinges on. Because as Charles grew weaker, as his treatment became more unpredictable, as private meetings with doctors became more frequent and more urgent, he had to ask himself the question no monarch ever wants to face. If I cannot continue, who protects the crown? You might assume the answer was obvious. Camilla, the Queen Consort. William, the Prince of Wales. The established line of succession, a clean, clear, simple transition. But nothing in the royal family is ever truly simple, especially when the monarch begins to fear that the people closest to him may not act in the best interest of the monarchy. Especially when rumors begin swirling that Camilla was trying to assert more influence over Charles's decisions, stepping into the vacuum created by his declining health. Especially when William, already burdened by his own family struggles, quietly expressed his reluctance to take on the throne prematurely. And especially when Princess Anne quietly and consistently became the one person Charles turned to during his darkest hours. Think about that. And the hardest working royal, the one who never complains, the one who takes on the duties no one else wants, the one who avoids drama, avoids spectacle, avoids the spotlight unless duty requires it. The public sees her as strong, steady, grounded. Charles saw her as something else entirely. He saw her as trustworthy. And trust, for a monarch nearing the point of no return, becomes more valuable than anything else, more valuable than tradition, more valuable than protocol, more valuable than public expectation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because before we reach the moment Charles declared his intention to hand the throne to Anne, we need to understand the pressure building around him, the fear, the urgency, the realization that the British monarchy was entering a moment it had not faced in nearly a century. a king too ill to reign effectively. Imagine the quiet of his private residence at Balmoral late at night, the slow tick of an antique clock, the sterile scent of medical equipment blended with the earthy smell of the Scottish Highlands. And imagine Charles, exhausted, reflective, realizing he couldn't run from reality anymore. That's when he asked to speak to and alone. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. It was emotional. It was painful. It was brutally honest. And it ended with Charles asking and a question she never wanted to hear. Will you take the crown if I can't continue? Most people don't realize how deeply this cut, and has always been the opposite of ambitious. She never sought grandeur. She never positioned herself for power. She never maneuvered for influence. Duty is her compass. Service is her nature. But the crown? That was never supposed to be hers. Yet Charles insisted. Why? What did he know? What did he fear? What had happened between him and Camilla that made him consider bypassing his own wife? This is where the contradictions start getting sharper. Because while the public saw a united royal couple, behind the scenes, Charles's trust in Camilla was quietly eroding. Some advisors noticed it. A few aides whispered about it. William felt it and saw it. And the reason became clearer with each passing day. Charles feared that Camilla might use her position as queen consort to influence decisions he believed belonged to the future of the crown, not the spouse of the monarch. Is that fair? Is it exaggerated? Is it emotional projection caused by illness? Those are the questions you need to ask yourself. But here's what matters. That's what Charles believed. And when you're a monarch, your beliefs, however private, shape the future of the entire nation. Meanwhile, the palace was dealing with its own chaos. The media was circling. Political leaders were quietly requesting updates. Rumors were spreading. And the pressure on Charles became unbearable. So he did something unprecedented. He requested a confidential meeting with 3 people, Princess and Prince William, and 1 senior advisor. No Camilla. That alone should tell you everything. During that meeting, Charles laid out his fears, his concerns, his hopes, his vision for the crown's future. And it became clear that he was contemplating a choice that would shake the monarchy to its core. A plan that involved bypassing Camilla in succession decisions. A plan that involved bypassing William, at least temporarily. A plan that placed the crown in the hands of the one person he believed could stabilize the royal family during the most fragile chapter in modern history. But this wasn't the explosive moment. That moment came later, when Charles signed a classified document that would remain hidden for weeks, sealed inside a leather vault, the only key entrusted to a single person. We'll get to that, because that document is the heart of this entire crisis. But the introduction must end where the story truly begins. A night at Balmoral, rain beating against the stone walls. And sitting beside her brother, holding his hand as he whispered something only she could hear. You must protect the monarchy, even if it means becoming what you never wanted to be. And said nothing at first. She looked at him. She looked at the ring. She looked at the future she never asked for. Then Charles told her the one thing he hadn't told anyone else. Not William, not the advisors, not even Camilla. The one thing that explains everything. That single revelation is what sets the entire chain of events into motion. And it is the reason you are watching this story unfold right now. Because on that night, in that room, with the sound of storm winds crashing against the windows, King Charles made a decision that would change the monarchy forever. A decision that would push the royal family toward its most dramatic transformation since the abdication crisis. A decision that would leave Camilla furious, William conflicted, and terrified, and the crown hanging by a thread. But what did Charles say to Anne? What truth did he confess? And what exactly did he sign? That is where our story truly begins. And what comes next will change everything, and no one, not even the royal family, saw it coming. What if the first sign of a royal crisis isn't a dramatic collapse on live television, but something far quieter? Something so subtle that millions watched it happen but didn't realize what they were seeing? A delayed step, a wince caught in a camera flash, a hand gripping a railing with just a fraction too much force. And then the moment that royal watchers still replay today, the king turning to walk toward his car after a public engagement, pausing mid-step as if something inside him had suddenly pulled tight. He blinked, steadied himself, smiled through it. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. You saw it. Millions saw it. But no one knew what it meant. Not yet. So here's the provocative question. What if those few seconds were the first visible crack in a secret that had been quietly eating away at the monarchy for months? And what if the people closest to the king, the ones sworn to protect him, were the very same people who ignored the signs? Because long before Charles whispered to and that she might have to protect the monarchy, the warning bells were already ringing. Let's walk through how it really unfolded. It began with fatigue. Not the normal kind. Not the too many engagements kind. This was the deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that sinks into a person like a weight. A type of tiredness that no amount of rest can erase. Staff noticed it first. His valet, his personal secretary, his longtime protective officer. Charles wasn't eating as much. He wasn't sleeping through the night. He wasn't staying focused during briefings, which, for a man notorious for detail, was alarming. Then came the medical appointments. Quiet. Private. Scheduled at odd hours. The palace tried to hide them, but insiders talk. And when a senior royal doctor begins visiting one location repeatedly, sometimes overnight, it becomes hard not to notice. What was the real moment things shifted? A phone call. A phone call Camilla didn't answer. That moment changes the entire story. Because according to one aide, Charles had been trying to reach her urgently. Not for company, not for reassurance, but because he needed help. He was in pain. Real pain. Not discomfort. Not fatigue. Pain. Sharp, sudden, frightening. He reached for the phone. Called her private number. She didn't pick up. He tried again. No answer. Sent a message. No reply. Minutes passed. He tried William next, but William was abroad on an engagement. Then Anne. And answered on the first ring. You see the contrast? Camilla, unavailable. William, unreachable. And immediate. That call was the first emotional shift. The first moment Charles realized who truly showed up when he needed someone, and arrived within hours. She walked into Charles's private sitting room and knew instantly something was wrong. His color was off. His hands were shaking. His breathing was shallow. She didn't hesitate. She ordered the doctors in. She ordered the staff out. She sat beside him and told him the thing no one else had the courage to say. You need to stop pretending you're fine. From that moment, and became more than a sister. She became his anchor. But the king's condition was worse than anyone expected. His cancer, the one the palace publicly described in vague, gentle terms, had progressed more aggressively than his medical team had hoped. There were complications, side effects, new symptoms that suggested the disease was exerting more pressure than before. That night became the turning point. The palace issued no statement, no warnings, no updates. But internally, panic. His medical team recommended he suspend all non-essential duties. Charles resisted. He was stubborn, determined, emotionally attached to his role, but his body was beginning to betray him. And this is where things begin to twist in ways no one anticipated. Because the worse his condition became, the more Charles pulled emotionally away from Camilla. No one likes to say this out loud. Not the palace, not commentators, not even some insiders. Because it implies cracks in a marriage that has been publicly painted as rock solid. But insiders whispered it anyway. There were arguments. Sharp words behind closed doors. Long hours apart. Days when Charles refused to discuss certain decisions with her. Why? A strange thing happens when a person faces their own mortality. They begin to reassess everything. Their fears, their regrets, their alliances, their trust. And Charles began reassessing Camilla. Was he punishing her for the unanswered phone call? Or was that call simply the moment he realized something deeper? We don't know. But here's what we do know. Charles told one advisor, a man who had served him for decades, that he feared Camilla might be too involved in palace maneuvering. That word, involved, carries weight. It suggests influence. It suggests interference. It suggests someone pushing where they shouldn't push. And when a monarch starts worrying about influence, succession becomes a central fear. Let's zoom in on the palace dynamics for a moment. William was trying to balance responsibility and reluctance. He didn't want the throne early. He didn't want the role forced on him while dealing with his own family pressures. He wanted time. Harry was out of the picture. Emotionally distant. Physically removed. Unavailable. Camilla was stepping forward, but perhaps too far forward for a fragile king who needed emotional comfort, not political strategy. And, meanwhile, stepped in quietly. No fanfare, no agenda, just presence, just loyalty. And loyalty is the currency Charles values most. The king's doctors recommended a series of urgent treatments, treatments that would leave him bedridden for days, weak for weeks, vulnerable for months. Privately, the medical team recommended something even more alarming. The king should consider preparing for a reduced role, at least temporarily. That's when everything erupted. Because the moment the doctors left the room, Charles turned to the one advisor present and said, "I need to know what happens to the crown if I cannot fulfill my duties." Those words triggered the first true constitutional alarm, because it meant Charles wasn't thinking in weeks. He was thinking in years, possibly final years. And if a monarch begins planning for final years, the system must respond, whether emotionally ready or not. Within 24 hours, royal legal advisors were reviewing emergency regency protocols. But Charles didn't want a regency. Not with Camilla. And here's the twist most people miss. Not with William either. At least not yet. Why? Because Charles could see the storm coming. The media pressure, the public scrutiny, the palace infighting, the succession debates. And he didn't want William's first months as king to be shaped by chaos. He wanted stability. And stability, in his mind, was Anne. So while the world saw a king simply struggling with illness, behind the scenes, Charles was orchestrating a backup plan no one expected. And this plan grew stronger the weaker he became. There was a night, a critical one, when Charles's condition took a frightening turn. He collapsed briefly. Doctors rushed in, and was the first family member there. Camilla arrived later. When she entered the room, Charles kept his eyes closed. Whether from exhaustion or avoidance, no one knows. But Anne noticed it. She noticed it again the next morning, and again the following evening. For the first time in decades, Charles was avoiding Camilla emotionally, at the exact same time he was clinging to Anne. Insiders at Balmoral described Charles as a man terrified not of dying, but of leaving the monarchy in the wrong hands. Think about that. Not himself, not his legacy, the monarchy. Because for Charles, the crown isn't just a symbol. It's a responsibility he has prepared for his entire life. A responsibility he believes must be protected even if he no longer can. Every monarch worries about their successor. But Charles worried about who would protect the monarchy during the transition. That fear, that deep, gnawing, unrelenting fear, is what led him to request the confidential meeting with William and one advisor. But we're not there yet. Because before that meeting happened, Charles made another decision, one that no one expected. He summoned his private secretary and asked him a question no monarch should ask lightly. If something happens to me in the next few weeks, what arrangements are already in place? That sentence sent shockwaves through the palace bureaucracy, because that phrasing, "something happens to me," is never used casually by a reigning monarch. It implies awareness, preparation, urgency. His private secretary briefed him, and Charles listened, quietly, nodding, processing. Then he asked, "And if I do not approve of the way those arrangements have been traditionally handled, can I amend them?" The answer, after a long pause, was yes. Within days, Charles began drafting personal instructions, private instructions, succession-related instructions, instructions that could override traditional expectations, instructions that would later become the sealed document that set the monarchy on fire. But this chapter isn't about the document. This chapter is about the emotional earthquake that caused it. Let's zoom in on one specific moment, a key turning point in this unfolding drama. It was a late evening, well past midnight. Charles hadn't slept. His breathing was shallow. His pain medication had worn off, and the doctors were slow to return. And was there, sitting, waiting, watching over him. Camilla had gone to bed hours earlier. A single lamp lit the room, casting shadows across the walls. Charles looked at and whispered, "I don't think I can keep doing this," and squeezed his hand, told him to rest. But he shook his head. "No, not my health. This." He gestured weakly toward the window, toward the world outside. This monarchy. And that was the moment. The moment Charles accepted that the crown was now bigger than him, that it needed protection stronger than tradition, stronger than protocol, stronger than public expectation. Protection he no longer believed Camilla could provide. Protection William wasn't ready to offer. Protection and had always provided without asking for anything in return. The next morning, he asked for the confidential meeting. And that action would force every royal, every advisor, and every observer to confront the question, what does it truly mean to safeguard a crown in the modern age when loyalty, not lineage, dictates succession? Because loyalty is a dangerous game. It's invisible, it's subjective, and when the king himself is the one defining it, it can either preserve the monarchy or destroy it. And the next chapter of this unfolding drama begins with the meeting Charles would convene. A meeting that would include only those he trusted most. A meeting that would expose divisions, reveal ambitions, and confirm alliances. A meeting that would set the stage for Anne's most extraordinary role yet. But before that meeting, there's one final twist. One revelation Charles shared with, and that would make her realize that the monarchy was teetering on the edge of crisis, and that the choices made in that room could alter history forever. And what came next? No one in that room expected. Have you ever noticed how some people are always in the background, quietly moving the pieces of a game no one else sees? They are the ones everyone underestimates. They are disciplined, loyal, relentless. And yet, when the moment arrives, they emerge as the unexpected linchpin, the one person everyone else suddenly realizes they cannot do without. For decades, Princess Anne fit that description perfectly. The world may have labeled her the workhorse royal, the understated princess, or the overlooked daughter, but in truth, Anne was quietly preparing for moments no one anticipated, moments like the one unfolding right now inside the walls of Balmoral. This chapter is about Anne, the sister who became the confidant, the anchor, and eventually, the only person the king believed could protect the crown in a time of unprecedented crisis. Let's start with her public persona. To the casual observer, Anne appeared conventional, dutiful, perhaps even austere. She was never in the tabloids for extravagant shopping sprees. She rarely posed for dramatic photographs. She executed her royal duties with precision, often quietly, often without recognition. Her speeches were factual, measured, devoid of sensationalism. She was professional, serious, loyal, and above all, reliable. But behind that exterior lay something far more formidable. Intelligence, discipline, and an instinct for strategy that rivaled even the most seasoned advisors. And studied protocols, understood the nuances of Commonwealth politics, and mastered the art of navigating the complex web of royal expectations. Decades of observing the monarchy gave her insight into what others often overlooked. Influence does not always come with titles. Power is not always public, and loyalty is sometimes more critical than law. Which brings us back to the moment Charles chose to confide in her. Because when a king on the brink of serious illness seeks counsel, he does not turn to someone he simply likes. He does not rely on charm or public visibility. He turns to someone whose judgment is incorruptible, whose discretion is flawless, and whose loyalty is absolute. And fit that description. And, in a way, she always had. Her rise, though quiet, was the culmination of decades of preparation, practice, and understated commitment. She had served in roles no one else wanted. She chaired organizations, attended military functions, oversaw charitable initiatives, and represented the crown across the globe, often under difficult circumstances. While others might have complained or sought the limelight, and performed flawlessly, day after day, year after year. And all of this now culminated in a moment that no one could have predicted. The king's health crisis had thrust her into the center of the monarchy's most critical contingency plan. But what makes Anne truly remarkable in this situation isn't just her competence. It's her understanding of the stakes. She grasped the tension between family, public perception, and constitutional law in ways most could not. She understood that the monarchy's survival depended on stability, on continuity, and on discretion. And she understood, most importantly, the delicate balance between personal ambition and duty, and never sought the throne. She never dreamed of wearing the crown. But she also understood that when duty called, one must answer, regardless of personal desire. And now, that call had arrived. Behind the walls of Balmoral, and quietly assumed her role. She listened to the king's fears, fears he had never voiced to anyone else. She helped him process the potential fallout of his illness. She counseled him on the implications of public perception and on the delicate mechanics of succession. And she prepared to act in ways that others, even those closest to the king, could not or would not. Anne's emergence in this moment was not sudden. It was the product of decades of preparation, discipline, and observation. Her rise was quiet, understated, but utterly decisive. And yet, even as she stepped into this role, she faced intense personal conflict. The throne was not hers to claim, yet she understood that her actions might determine the survival of the monarchy itself. Every choice carried consequences. Every word, every gesture, every decision could have ripple effects across the nation, the Commonwealth, and the royal family. In some ways, the moment reminded Anne of the very essence of her public life. Constant service, often unrecognized, but always indispensable. She had never sought recognition, and now she faced a situation where recognition and authority might become unavoidable. Meanwhile, Charles continued to confide in her. Each discussion revealed more of his fears, his hopes, and his intentions. He described the nuances of succession, the potential pitfalls, and the risks of leaving the monarchy in uncertain hands, and absorbed every word, every concern, and every unspoken warning. She understood that the weight on her shoulders was immense, but necessary. The king's reliance on and also illuminated the fractures elsewhere in the royal household. Camilla, increasingly marginalized in these critical decisions, became a source of tension. William, though supportive, was grappling with his own conflicts. Loyalty to his father, the timing of his eventual succession, and the dynamics with his sister. Anne's role, therefore, was not just about capability. It was about trust, discretion, and emotional intelligence. She became the stabilizing force in a storm where loyalty was scarce and ambition ran high, and the world would soon begin to notice. Reports from Balmoral, though carefully controlled, started to hint at shifts within the royal household. Observers noted subtle changes. And taking the lead in engagements usually reserved for senior royals, providing counsel in areas where others were silent, and, most importantly, being present in moments that mattered most. Her rise was not flamboyant. It was not theatrical. It was strategic, calculated, and profoundly effective. Yet, even as Anne assumed this central role, she faced the shadow of public expectation. The British monarchy, after all, thrives on perception. Any hint of instability, internal conflict, or deviation from tradition could trigger a public and political crisis, and had to navigate these waters delicately, ensuring that her actions preserved the institution while managing the delicate balance of family loyalty. And then came the critical moment that would test everything. A private meeting convened by the king, involving only those he trusted most. A meeting designed to address succession contingencies, evaluate trust, and chart a course for the monarchy in the event of his incapacity. Anne's presence in this meeting was pivotal. She was no longer a bystander. She was now an integral actor in a high-stakes scenario where every word mattered. The meeting revealed layers of complexity within the royal household. There were tensions, quiet confrontations, and unspoken rivalries. The king's distrust of Camilla became evident. William's internal conflicts surfaced, and Anne's calm authority stood in stark contrast to the unease around her. It was during this meeting that Anne began to truly understand the scope of her responsibility. The monarchy's continuity depended on her judgment, discretion, and loyalty. She realized that her choices could have historical implications, shaping the institution's future for decades. And she accepted it. Anne's rise, therefore, was not a product of ambition or circumstance alone. It was the result of preparation, competence, and an unwavering commitment to duty. She had become the person the king trusted most, not because she sought power, but because she had earned it through decades of service, integrity, and insight. But the moment of realization was bittersweet, and understood that stepping into this role would inevitably create conflict, tension, and resentment. Particularly from Camilla, whose ambitions and expectations had been sidelined. William, too, would face emotional and political challenges as he navigated the delicate dynamics of family loyalty and public perception. Anne's rise was remarkable, but it was also precarious. One misstep could destabilize the monarchy entirely. One miscalculation could shift the balance of power, incite public scrutiny, and spark political controversy. And yet, Anne remained resolute. She understood the stakes, embraced her role, and prepared to act decisively when the time came. Because in the world of royalty, moments like this are rare. Opportunities to safeguard the monarchy, to act with discretion, and to influence history rarely arrive with clarity. And recognized the gravity of the situation, and she stepped forward, fully aware that the decisions she made in the coming days could define not only her own legacy, but the future of the British crown. But just as and was solidifying her position, Charles took the next step, one that would escalate tensions, challenge assumptions, and set the stage for a series of unprecedented events. Because the king, in his wisdom and urgency, was preparing to formalize his trust in a way that would shock the royal household, the public, and the world alike. And what happened next? Would force and to confront her deepest fears, navigate treacherous family dynamics, and prepare for a role she had never sought but could not refuse. What happens when the most powerful person in the United Kingdom calls a meeting so secretive that even the closest aides are excluded? When the monarch is unwell, is every move scrutinized, every word potentially explosive, the stakes rise exponentially. And when that king is Charles, a man whose health is deteriorating and whose trust is limited to only a few, the consequences of such a meeting become extraordinary. This was that meeting. Balmoral, late evening, the castle shrouded in the dark Scottish mist, windows glistening from relentless rain. Outside, the Highlands howled with wind. Inside, only a handful of people were allowed: Charles, Princess and Prince William, and a single senior advisor. No Camilla, no other family members. Not even the Queen Consort's allies. The secrecy of the meeting alone sent a message. It said, without words, that the monarchy was on the brink, that decisions were being made behind closed doors that could alter centuries of tradition, and that the king, fragile and resolute, was preparing to act decisively. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Every subtle movement carried weight. Every glance had significance. And, calm as ever, took a seat beside Charles. William, uneasy yet attentive, remained on the opposite side of the king. The advisor sat slightly behind, silent, observing, recording only mentally what transpired. Charles opened the meeting without preamble. "I have reached a point where I must consider all contingencies," he said. His voice was steady, though slightly brittle. "My health, my capacity, my longevity, all are uncertain. And with that uncertainty comes responsibility. The crown cannot be left exposed." And nodded slightly. William shifted in his chair. Both understood the gravity, but only and seemed fully prepared for what was coming. Charles continued, "I have always trusted family, but trust is complicated. I have reservations, and I must act where I feel the monarchy's stability is at risk." The words hung in the air. A pause followed, and, trained for these moments, said nothing, giving the king space to continue. William's face betrayed a mixture of confusion, worry, and suppressed anger. Then Charles laid out the scenario that had been haunting him for weeks. He spoke of potential health crises that could incapacitate him suddenly. He described his fears about the monarchy's perception, the reactions of the public, and the ripple effects across the Commonwealth. He spoke candidly about Camilla, his wife, and why he believed she could not be relied upon to safeguard the crown in a crisis. It was unprecedented. A king openly discussing the limitations of his spouse in succession planning. And absorbed it all. She understood not just the legal, but the emotional weight of Charles's concerns. She understood that this wasn't about personal animosity. It wasn't about favoritism. It was about loyalty, competence, and preserving centuries of history. Charles then turned his attention to William. "I know you are next in line. I understand your reluctance. I understand your responsibilities. But the question is not your willingness alone. It is whether the monarchy will endure if decisions are made under pressure, in chaos, or in haste." William's hands clenched slightly. He had expected discussions about contingency plans, regency protocols, even potential advisors. But the implication was clear. Charles was contemplating alternatives. Charles was considering bypassing the expected line of authority in critical moments. And steadfast, capable, and loyal was the central figure in that plan. Anne's mind raced. She understood exactly what the king was implying. She might be called upon to act in a capacity no one had ever imagined for her. to protect the monarchy not as a consultant, not as a secondary presence, but as a principal stabilizing force, perhaps even as acting head, temporarily or indefinitely. The room grew heavy. Silence followed Charles's words. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Inside, a different storm was brewing. The emotional, political, and constitutional tension of a secret plan that could destabilize the royal family. Charles reached for a folder on the table. Its leather cover was worn but polished, edges frayed from years of use. He slid it toward Anne. "This," he said, "contains the instructions you must understand. Not for now, but for when the time comes. You must be ready." And accepted the folder, her pulse quickening. She could feel the weight of its contents before even opening it. She understood that it represented more than instructions. It represented trust, responsibility, and potentially a role she had never sought, the preservation of the monarchy itself. William leaned forward. "Father, we need to be careful," he said. His tone was measured but firm. "These decisions, they have long-term consequences. If the public learns you're contemplating bypassing Camilla or questioning succession protocol, the backlash could be immense." Charles nodded. "I am aware. That is why this remains confidential. But William, I must make this choice with absolute certainty. I cannot leave the crown vulnerable, and I cannot rely solely on traditional expectations." And understands the gravity of the situation, and she is the only person I trust completely. A tension-filled pause. And looked down at the folder, then back at her brother. William's gaze shifted between the two, reading the room, weighing the implications. The advisor, silent but alert, sensed the delicate balance of power, loyalty, and obligation. Charles continued, outlining potential scenarios in which his health could deteriorate rapidly. He spoke of hospitalizations, public engagements, and the possibility of media leaks. He described how Camilla might react, emotionally, politically, and publicly, and why he felt her involvement could be destabilizing. And listened, her mind cataloging every contingency, every nuance, every risk. She realized the stakes. The crown, the monarchy, and the family's legacy depended on her understanding and discretion. She would be required to act, to guide, and perhaps to assume authority in ways no princess had before. Then came the most critical moment. Charles looked at Anne directly. "If I cannot act, if my condition worsens suddenly, you must step in. You must protect the monarchy, the line of succession, and the institution itself. No one else is guaranteed to do so." Anne's heart pounded. She had anticipated this conversation, but the reality of hearing it, of being tasked with such responsibility, was overwhelming. She felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. Every decision she made from that moment forward would have historical significance. William broke the silence. "Father, we need to think about the optics. The Commonwealth, the advisors, Parliament. If Anne assumes responsibility in this manner, we could face backlash. Public confidence could waver." Charles's expression hardened. "I understand. That is why discretion is paramount. And is prepared. William, you will support her. Not interfere. Support. And act with loyalty, not hesitation." And nodded. She felt the full magnitude of her role: protector, stabilizer, confidant, and potential acting sovereign. Every instinct she had developed over decades of service now became essential. Every lesson in diplomacy, duty, and strategy would be tested. The meeting continued into the night. Scenarios were debated, contingencies outlined, communication strategies considered. Every detail was scrutinized. By the time it concluded, the three were exhausted, but the plan was clear. And would be the linchpin, the one trusted to maintain continuity, safeguard tradition, and ensure the monarchy endured whatever crises lay ahead. As the meeting adjourned, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, and carried the weight of the folder, understanding that its contents were more than instructions. They were a blueprint for survival. William remained contemplative, grappling with his own role and his father's trust in his sister. Charles, frail yet resolute, had taken a decisive step to secure the monarchy's future, in a manner both unprecedented and controversial. But the true test of this plan had not yet arrived. Leaks, rumors, and internal conflicts were inevitable. Camilla would eventually discover the implications of this secret meeting. William would be forced to navigate the complexities of loyalty and public perception, and would face challenges no royal had ever confronted in modern times. And perhaps most importantly, the world had no idea this had happened. The public continued to see a united family, a king performing duties with decorum. But behind closed doors, the foundation of succession was quietly, dramatically, and irrevocably shifting. The next steps would be critical. Documents would be prepared, contingencies formalized, loyalties tested, and in the coming days, the first signs of friction, conflict, and potential betrayal would emerge. Because in a monarchy, trust is currency, and in this instance, it was scarce. And what came next would bring the first major domino crashing down, setting in motion events that no one in the palace anticipated, and creating a scenario that would challenge. But this wasn't about legal succession. It was about practical succession, about the messy, fragile, chaotic moments when a monarch is too ill to serve, when decisions must be made by someone else, and when power shifts in the shadows before it shifts in public. This is where Charles became trapped in an impossible dilemma. If he adhered strictly to tradition, Camilla would become the central figure during any regency scenario. And Charles didn't trust that. Not anymore. If he followed the legal path, William would be thrust into a role he wasn't emotionally or politically ready for. And if he forced William into it too soon, the monarchy could face backlash, destabilization, or even a public confidence crisis. If he relied on advisors or parliament to govern while he was debilitated, the crown could appear weak, a symbol without agency, controlled by politicians instead of royals. So Charles began evaluating every possibility, every scenario, every risk. He reviewed historic cases, George III's madness, Edward VIII's abdication, the regency for the young Queen Victoria. He observed how other monarchies handled transitions, the Dutch, the Japanese, the Scandinavian models. And what he found was unsettling. Most monarchies collapse, not because of weak rulers, but because of weak transitions. If the wrong person holds power even briefly, even symbolically, even in auxiliary capacity, the entire system can spiral. Charles believed Camilla could cause precisely that spiral. He believed William, if rushed, could falter emotionally. He believed the monarchy, already weakened by scandal and division, could fracture under the wrong stewardship. So he turned to the one person he trusted to steady the institution, Anne. But turning to her was not simple. It required navigating centuries-old laws, constitutional expectations, and public optics. And every path Charles considered led him into deeper complications. Let's break down the three major dilemmas that consumed him. The first dilemma: the queen consort's power gap. Many people assume a queen consort holds no political power. Legally, that's true. But practically, a queen consort influences schedules, public appearances, narrative, access to the monarch, perception, internal staffing, media messaging. And when a monarch is sick, the consort's influence skyrockets. If Camilla stepped into that role during Charles's incapacitation, she would effectively shape the monarchy's public narrative. And Charles feared she would try to protect her position, not the institution. He felt her ambition, subtle, understated, but consistent, and worried that ambition could disrupt everything. This wasn't about malice. It was about motive. Camilla had fought for acceptance for decades. And now that she finally had it, Charles feared she would fight just as fiercely to keep it. This fear became the first crack in the foundation of succession. The second dilemma: William's reluctance. William had always known he would be king, but knowing and being ready are not the same thing. And when Charles looked into his son's eyes during that meeting, he saw exhaustion, conflict, and emotional fatigue. He saw a man burdened by public expectation, private grief, marital pressures, and global scrutiny. William wasn't ready. He admitted as much privately. He wanted stability, clarity, time. Charles, fearing he might have very little time left, understood the cruelty of forcing the crown upon someone too soon. And then came the unspoken truth. If William took the throne prematurely and failed, even slightly, the media would devour him, the public would question him, and the monarchy would suffer. Charles could not risk that. The third dilemma: the Commonwealth question. This is the piece almost everyone misses. The Commonwealth, over 50 nations, relies on the British monarch as symbolic head. Stability is everything. Succession is everything. Some nations were already questioning their ties. Jamaica, Barbados, Australia. If the transition was messy, chaotic, or scandalous, it could accelerate a mass departure. Charles knew that, and understood it even more deeply. William feared it, which created the third corner of the trap Charles was in. If the monarchy appeared weak, confused, divided, it could shatter internationally. He needed someone who could project calm, unity, competence, and continuity, someone respected across the Commonwealth for decades. And that person was Anne. The contingency that broke tradition. So Charles crafted a plan, a contingency, not a legal rewrite. A practical shift of power, not an amendment to succession law. He wanted Anne to serve as the stabilizing force in the event of his incapacitation. She would oversee key engagements. She would coordinate with advisors. She would act as intermediary between William and the palace. She would manage internal disputes. She would guide decisions requiring royal judgment. Effectively, she would run the monarchy, not as queen, not as regent, but as the acting authority in everything that mattered emotionally, politically, strategically. A silent sovereign. This is the part Charles didn't put in writing yet, but this is exactly what the folder contained. Instructions, guidelines, frameworks, and the beginnings of a document that could formalize his intentions if necessary. This was the step that terrified him most. Because what if this plan leaked? What if Camilla found out? What if politicians questioned it? What if William felt overshadowed? What if the public interpreted it as Charles disinheriting his son? Every scenario led to potential catastrophe. And yet, Charles believed the greater catastrophe was doing nothing. Anne's role in the dilemma, and spent days quietly absorbing the enormity of what Charles expected from her. She knew. Camilla would see it as a betrayal. William would feel conflicted. Harry, if he learned of it, might interpret it as favoritism or a slight. The press, if they discovered it, would explode. The palace machinery would strain under secrecy. And did not flinch. Why? Because unlike others, she didn't see the crown as ambition. She saw it as responsibility, a duty that transcended family politics. She walked the corridors of Balmoral at night, thinking through every consequence. She revisited her decades of service. She imagined the public reaction. She imagined the headlines. She imagined the backlash. She imagined the weight. And still, she concluded one thing. If not her, then who? If she stepped back, the monarchy could fall into chaos. If she stepped forward, she could be the reason it survived. That clarity, that sense of unshakable duty, made her the only person Charles could trust. The decision that shook the palace. Days after the secret meeting, Charles made the move that would become the core of the succession dilemma. He instructed his private secretary to draft a document outlining a temporary transfer of responsibilities in the event of incapacitation. This wasn't the Regency Act. This wasn't abdication. This wasn't traditional succession. This was Charles's personal directive, a monarch preparing for survival mode. Anne's name appeared throughout the draft. Not Camilla's, not William's, Anne's. But before the document could be finalized, before the plan could be sealed, before the palace machinery could even prepare, someone else learned about it. Someone who wasn't in the meeting. Someone who wasn't meant to know. Someone who had everything to lose if and stepped into power. And that person was about to ignite chaos inside the palace, and in the media, in Parliament, and across the Commonwealth. Because the moment this person discovered the draft, they took action, and what they did next would change the trajectory of Charles's plan completely. Who found out? Who discovered the draft? The quiet, private, deeply confidential instruction Charles intended only for Anne, William, and a single advisor. Who saw what should have been invisible? Who learned what was never meant to leak? One person, one moment, one accidental discovery, or perhaps not so accidental. This is the chapter where the stakes explode. This is where Charles's secret plan, the plan to entrust and, not Camilla, with the monarchy's stability, moves from whispered theory to dangerous reality. Let's go directly into the moment that changed everything. The private secretary had followed Charles's instructions meticulously. Draft notes, succession contingencies, temporary transfer language, emergency procedures, even a proposed timeline in the event of sudden incapacitation. Everything was carefully placed inside a leather folder, the kind used for royal correspondence, the iconic Windsor red binding with gold embossing. Only 3 people were supposed to know it existed. But the palace isn't a fortress of airtight secrecy. It is a labyrinth, a living organism, a place where staff move like shadows, where eyes wander, where whispers cling to walls like dust. And one of those shadows, a senior staff member deeply loyal to Camilla, walked into a room they weren't supposed to be in, glanced toward a desk they weren't supposed to approach, and saw a folder they weren't supposed to touch. At first, they didn't open it. They didn't dare. But the label caught their eye. Directive, in case of incapacity. No royal document carries a title like that. Not unless something is exceptionally wrong. Curiosity, fear, loyalty, suspicion. It was enough. The folder was opened. And within minutes, they realized what Charles had done. And everywhere. Anne's name in roles traditionally held by the queen consort. Anne's authority outlined in spheres normally assigned to the heir. And positioned not as a supporting royal, but as the monarchy's interim center of gravity. To this staff member, it was betrayal. Betrayal of Camilla. Betrayal of the queen's future. Betrayal of the woman who had stood by Charles for decades. And in that moment, something snapped. Panic set in. Camilla had to know. What followed next was not a confrontation. It was worse. It was a slow, careful planting of doubt. A soft suggestion during tea that something felt off. A nervous question about Charles's recent decisions, a mention of responsibilities shifting in unusual ways. Camilla listened. Camilla noticed. Camilla asked neutral questions with deliberate calm, and the staff member, sensing hesitation, sensing curiosity, sensing opportunity, took the final step. There's a document you should see. About the future. About your role. The trap was set. Camilla's discovery of the draft wasn't explosive. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't storm into Charles's room. She did something far more dangerous. She went silent. Silent rage. Silent hurt. Silent calculation. Because in silence, Camilla does her most strategic thinking. For decades, she survived scandal not through charm alone, but through patience, planning, and a ruthless understanding of optics. And now, she saw something catastrophic. Charles was preparing to sideline her. Not legally, not officially, but practically. And in a monarchy, practical authority is often more powerful than legal authority. She understood instantly. If she did nothing, and would hold enormous power the moment Charles became incapacitated. Influence, public narrative, staff loyalty, media interpretation, relationships with the Commonwealth. All would flow through, and not her. And so, Camilla made a decision. A fateful one. She would confront Charles, but not immediately. Confrontation, after all, was too obvious, too emotional, too easy to dismiss. She needed leverage. She needed sympathy. She needed proof she was being sidelined unfairly. She needed allies. And more importantly, she needed the monarchy and the public to believe that she, not Anne, was the rightful stabilizing figure if the king faltered. But Charles had beaten her to something crucial, something she did not yet know. He had already arranged for the draft to be rewritten, formally. The sealed document. We now enter the most secretive part of this entire saga. Once Charles saw the draft, he made adjustments, clarifications, notes, requests. He crossed out sections. He rewrote lines. He made Anne's role even clearer, focusing on continuity of engagements, authority to coordinate with Commonwealth heads, oversight of communication strategies, protection of the heir from premature pressure, insulation of the monarchy from internal manipulation. Then he arranged for an official copy, a real one, not a draft, not a working outline, a sealed directive, signed, witnessed, classified, a document that, once completed, would be locked in a restricted access vault deep within the palace's most secure wing. Historically, sealed directives have only been issued a handful of times. During wars, during assassination threats, during abdication planning, during royal emergency scenarios. Charles believed his health and the instability around him warranted such a measure. Only 2 people would have keys to access the document. The king, Princess Anne, not William, not advisors, not Camilla. This was the moment and felt the full weight of what was unfolding. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She didn't react emotionally. She simply nodded, the kind of slow, steady nod that tells you someone has fully understood the burden placed upon them. The sealed document was finalized and placed in the vault. And the moment it locked into place, the atmosphere inside Balmoral changed. Every sound felt echoing. Every glance felt loaded. Every move felt deliberate. And the walls began to close in. Because once a directive like that exists, it becomes the monarchy's greatest vulnerability and its greatest strength. If it leaked, if it were destroyed, if Camilla found proof, if Parliament caught wind of it, if the media got even a whisper. Panic, scandal, constitutional crisis, public outrage, political turbulence, a potential collapse of confidence in the king himself. And knew this. William knew this. Charles knew this. Camilla? She sensed something was wrong, but she hadn't yet found the sealed directive. She only had the draft. But the draft alone was dangerous. It was enough to fuel suspicion, enough to ignite anger, enough to spur action. And so she acted. She confronted the advisor. She summoned her closest allies. She demanded explanations. Her anger grew, but her strategy remained sharp. She had leverage. She had the draft. She had a narrative. The king is not well, and others are manipulating him. It was a narrative that could destroy Anne. It was a narrative that could create public sympathy. It was a narrative that could flip the monarchy upside down. But Camilla didn't know Charles had already been notified that someone unauthorized had seen the draft. He didn't know who. He only knew how dangerous the situation now was. So he made another drastic decision, one that would escalate the conflict to a level no one expected. He ordered that the sealed document's existence be hidden even from senior advisors. A secret hidden inside a secret. Layers upon layers of confidentiality. But secrecy always has a cost, because it creates suspicion, resentment, paranoia, the cracks through which disaster grows. Something was about to give. And it happened sooner than anyone expected. Late one night, Charles summoned Anne again, this time in urgency, not planning. He needed to tell her something. Something new. Something alarming. Something that would change everything. Because the sealed document, the one meant to protect the monarchy, the one meant to secure Anne's temporary authority, it was no longer safe. Someone had tried to access it, and the palace cameras had captured the attempt. The image didn't show the face clearly, but it showed enough to identify the silhouette. And that silhouette belonged to someone no one expected. A silhouette, a blurred outline on a security monitor, a figure moving down a forbidden corridor deep inside Balmoral, where only a tiny handful of people had clearance. This wasn't a tourist. This wasn't an aide. This wasn't a staff member wandering by mistake. This was someone who knew where the vault was. Someone who knew what they wanted. Someone who knew this corridor was off limits, and assumed no one would ever find out they had tried to access it. That grainy footage, shown only to Charles, and the head of palace security, became the tipping point. Because the silhouette was unmistakable. Even in shadow, even with distorted outlines, even with poor resolution, the shape of the hair, the posture, the body language were instantly recognizable. Camilla, Queen Consort, the woman Charles no longer trusted. The woman who had already seen the draft and was desperate to know more. The woman who now appeared to be attempting to access the sealed directive, the document meant to keep her out of the line of informal authority. And Charles snapped, not in rage, not in grief, not in disgust, but in clarity, cold, absolute clarity. He knew what he had to do. He could no longer rely on half measures or vague instructions. He could no longer leave the future of the monarchy at the mercy of secrecy, drafts, hidden folders, or whispered plans. He could no longer pretend the situation was manageable. If Camilla was attempting to access the vault, then she already sensed, or knew, far too much. And if she knew too much, she might try to use it. Publicly, politically, emotionally, strategically. And if that happened, the monarchy would fracture in ways that couldn't be undone. So Charles made the decision. The one he had avoided. The one he feared. The one he knew would change history. He would designate Anne, not just as acting stabilizer, not just as temporary authority, not just as an informal anchor. No, he would designate her as his successor. In plain language, in formal writing, in legally binding terms within the framework of abdication contingency. He would bypass Camilla, bypass informal interpretations, and, at least temporarily, bypass William, and would become queen. Not acting queen, not interim queen, not shadow queen. Queen. The night he told her, the atmosphere inside Balmoral shifted into something surreal, silent, tense, intimate, heavy with emotional gravity, and had been summoned without explanation. She entered Charles's private sitting room expecting another late-night discussion, another conversation about logistics or planning. But the minute she saw Charles's eyes, she froze. He wasn't just sick. He wasn't just tired. He wasn't just worried. He was resolved. A man who had fought his illness for months without complaint now looked at her with expression that felt carved into stone. And, he said quietly, "Sit down." She did. Slowly. Uneasily. Her instinct told her this wasn't like the earlier briefings. Charles looked at her for a long moment, breathing shaky but eyes steady. "I have seen the footage," and felt her stomach tighten. She didn't need to ask what footage. "And now I understand," Charles continued softly, "that the crown cannot survive under these conditions." He paused, his breath strained. He lifted a trembling hand toward her. "You are the only one who can protect it." And blinked. "Support it, yes. Advise it, yes. But..." "No," Charles cut her off gently but firmly. "Not support. Not advise. Lead." And stared at him. For a moment, she genuinely thought she had misheard. Led? Led what? Led the monarchy?